Deborah, thank you so much. This morning, I invite you to take your sermon notes and follow along. Take notes if you desire to. I'm going to begin a new sermon series this morning that I'm going to be preaching for the next couple of months. Haven't totally worked it all out yet, but we're going to be looking at some of the parables of Jesus. I'm calling this series Stories with a Purpose. The parables of Jesus, there's approximately 40 of them in Scripture. You find them in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Interestingly, there's 4 Gospels, as you likely know, but there's no parables that Jesus told in the Gospel of John. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are full of them. Now, a parable is it's basically a word picture, okay? Or as I like to think of it, it's a story with a point, okay? That Jesus was a great storyteller, and his stories always had a kingdom point to tell us about what life is like in the kingdom. And it was a common technique that the Jewish rabbis would use back in Jesus' day in order to teach, where they would take common images from everyday life, and then they would attach spiritual truth, spiritual principles to those common images. And there was a lot of advantages to it because, people back then were very similar to us today. They loved a good story. Anybody here love a good story? Anybody here find it much, much easier to remember a story than to remember a bunch of facts? Anybody like that? Absolutely. Well, maybe that's the way we're wired, right? I think I'm that way. I can remember a story. In fact, as someone that for years I have been public speaking in sermons and everything, I try to keep meticulous records of the stories that I tell, so that I don't repeat them. Now, literally, I could probably go back a year in the past and preach the same message that I had preached a year ago, and I wouldn't be surprised if none of y'all even realized that I preached the same message. Sometimes I wonder, why don't I? But if I told the same story, many of y'all, that light bulb would be clicking on in your mind going, I've heard that somewhere before, right? You see, the way we're wired, we appreciate a good story. Well, the Jewish rabbis, and Jesus being a Jewish rabbi, he understood that and knew that stories, or as we know them as parables, were really good teaching tools to help people understand deeper truths. In the Gospel of Matthew, we will find numerous parables, but it's fascinating. In Matthew 1 through 12, the first 12 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, there's none. No parables in the first 12 chapters. It's almost half the book. Okay? No parables. But in Matthew chapter 13, a major shift occurs in Jesus' teaching. And the Bible tells us from that point on, Jesus began to teach in many parables. The disciples even asked him, why? Why do you teach in many parables? And in Matthew chapter 13, verse 13, I love the way the Message translation puts it. He says that that's why I tell stories to create readiness. Jesus is speaking. To nudge the people toward receptive insight. In their present state, they can stare till doomsday and not see it. Listen until they're blue in the face and not get it. If you aren't sure what Jesus is talking about that, just think of the last class that you have sat in listening to a lecture. You know, you listen to your blue in the face and it's still pew. Am I right? Absolutely. You know, it just goes right over the top of our head. We can listen and listen. But Jesus tells stories. There's two main purposes of parables. That parables serve a twofold purpose. They are there to conceal and to reveal truth. Parables are there to both conceal and reveal truth. But that begs the question, like Jesus said, that not everybody that has ears can actually hear. Not everybody that has eyes can actually see. But here's the question. A question I've struggled with for years. Why would Jesus conceal the truth? I mean, the truth is there for our good, right? Why in the world would Jesus conceal the truth? Well, J.D. Wall, Carol, one of your favorite Bible teachers, one of mine as well, J.D. describes the parables as being kind of serving as a kind of a fishing technique for Jesus. Now, the fishing that we're talking about here is not casting a line out with a rod and reel. We're talking about throwing a cast net out. A large net that you cast out. Kirk, you took me several years ago up on the river and where you threw a cast net out by the dam. I don't know if you remember. And you spread that net out to catch fish that we ended up using as cut bait as we went along the river. Well, J.D. Walt would say that that is kind of the purpose of a parable, is that it was like Jesus throwing that cast net out, and some people would be caught up in the net. And they would ask Jesus what that parable meant. I wonder, could it really be that simple? Could the secret to understanding the things of the kingdom simply be asking Jesus what it means, but then hanging around long enough to hear his answer? Is it possible? You know, sometimes we can ask the questions, but we don't really want to hear the answer. I had somebody just this past week that was asking me questions about why I felt the way I felt about something. but it quickly became apparent he had no desire in knowing why I felt about something. All he wanted to do was tell me why he felt the way he felt. Have you ever been there? Have you ever had somebody treat you that way? Or have you ever treated somebody else that way, like I have? Sometimes we can use our questions as a way of getting our point across rather than really getting an answer to the question. Is it possible that the key to understanding the ways of the kingdom, that Jesus is teaching of the kingdom, is simply to ask the questions and hang around long enough in order to hear and understand his answer? Could it really be that simple? Well, one of the parables that Jesus tells, this is actually the second parable in the Gospel of Matthew. The first is the parable of the sower, but I'm not going to speak on that during this season because it dawned on me that I preached on that parable a few weeks ago, and so I'm not going to repeat myself, or at least not going to repeat the stories. You may, okay, but so I want to go and I want to read a parable to you that we refer to as the parable of the weeds. In some versions of the Bible, it may be called the parable of the weeds and the tares. Okay? Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in the field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first gather the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." This is the word of God for us this morning. The story that Jesus tells is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. A farmer plants seeds out in the field. At night, the enemy comes and sows weeds in the field, and when the wheat grows above ground and then the weeds also appear, the farmhands want to go out there and pull the weeds up, but the farmer says no, because basically the roots of the weeds are probably intertwined with the roots of the wheat, and if you pull one up, you're going to end up pulling both up, so we'll just wait until the time of the harvest, and then we'll separate the wheat from the weeds, and then we'll burn the weeds. Now, for some, this may be a story about farming. For Jesus, this is a story about the kingdom, about kingdom living. It's a story with a point. It's a story about living the Christian life. And so it was an image that was very familiar to the people back then. Back in ancient times, there was kings would often be at war with one another. And when kings were at war with one another, one of the common certain things that a king would do. He would send his army to destroy the fields of his enemy. Now, sometimes there's a variety of ways that you could destroy a field. You could set wild animals loose in the field and they would destroy it. Have any of y'all that own land or lease land, have any of y'all seen the damage that just a couple of wild hogs can do in a field? I mean, they can destroy a field overnight. Or maybe they would set fire to the field. And that likewise can destroy a field overnight. But why would the enemy do this? Well, they would do it because if you could destroy your enemy's agricultural base, you destroy their food source. And soldiers who can't eat can't fight. And so you would eventually end up winning the battle. But if an opposing army went in and set fire to the field or set wild animals loose in the field, the effect and the impact would be immediate. They wouldn't have time to get away. But if they go in and plant seeds of weeds and sow weeds in the field, the impact isn't quite so immediate. In fact, it may take days or weeks or months even before the impact of the weeds begin to destroy their enemy's agricultural base. The impact is slow, but the impact is devastating. So, what is the problem with weeds? Remember, we're talking about kingdom stuff here, not farming. So what is the problem with weeds? I want to give you just a couple. There's probably many more than this, but the first problem that I see with weeds is that weeds often look like the real thing. They often look like the real thing. It's hard sometimes to distinguish a weed from the plant. A while back, I had planted several rows of carrots. I love fresh carrots, and I had planted several rows, and I had tended to them, and after they started coming up, I even thinned them out because, as you know, carrots grow, it's the root that you're eating with carrots, and so I thinned them out, and it was looking really good until the weeds appeared. And it was weird. The weeds really looked a lot like the carrots. You see, weeds can look a lot like the real thing. There can be weeds in our spiritual lives as well that, Jesus promises joy, and the world offers something that may look like the real thing, but it's weed. It's not the real thing. In Matthew chapter 7:21, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Not everybody that says Jesus. Not everyone who says that they pray is the real thing. Not everyone that sits in church is the real thing. You know, there can be weeds that can not only destroy your individual walk with Christ, weeds can destroy a church, weeds can destroy a family, weeds can destroy a nation if they are allowed to grow. Let me give you a second thing about weeds. Weeds impede growth. Number 2, weeds impede growth. The reason why those weeds were so destructive to my carrots was because eventually the weeds were receiving the nourishment that I wanted to go to my carrots. And I wonder in our lives today, how do those weeds, you know, while I was praying this morning, and you know, bitterness and anger can be a weed. And that is why I asked for prayer this morning. Because if you feed the weeds of bitterness and anger, those weeds will take over the fruit of love and joy and peace. Unforgiveness is a weed that will destroy you. Okay? It will impede your growth. The nourishment that is intended for spiritual growth will instead be feeding the weed of bitterness and anger and unforgiveness and gossip. And you could go on and on and on. The weeds. And they will destroy the harvest. The third problem that I see with weeds is that weeds produce a lot of seeds, but no fruit. Weeds produce a lot of seeds, but no fruit. You know, it's amazing to me how quickly weeds can spread. A while back, I had a half dozen, maybe, beautiful stands of zucchini. And I had a lot of little zucchini squash on those vines. And I knew I was going to be eating zucchini every day all summer, 3 meals a day. Because some of them were as big as baseball bats. I just knew they were going to be that big. But you know what? I was gone one weekend. And I came back, and the weeds had taken over. From all those little zucchini that I had on those vines, I got one zucchini from all of those. You see, weeds produce a lot of seeds, but no fruit. The last thing is weeds are persistent. Kelly and I have some azaleas planted out in front of the house. Kelly will go out there with a hoe and she'll weed out there. I'll pull up weeds, but you know what? They keep coming back. And anybody ever experienced the persistency of weeds? Think about it spiritually. Those spiritual weeds keep coming back. Bitterness, gossip, anger. You get where I'm going with it? Now remember, a parable, by definition, is a story with a point. So what are some lessons that we can learn from this parable? Remember, Jesus wasn't teaching about gardening here. That wasn't what he was doing. He was teaching about the kingdom, about life. So what are some lessons? Here are some that I need to learn. You may have others, but let me whet your appetite. The first one is that Satan is constantly at work. Later on in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus interprets this parable for his disciples. Remember, they got the answer because they asked. And they hung around long enough to listen to the answer. And in his answer, the key was clear. If the weeds came from Satan. Satan doesn't have to send a tragedy in your life. All he has to do is plant weeds. And if he plants weeds, eventually he's got you. Because that's what weeds do. They take over. Do you realize that while God is working to bring people into the kingdom, Satan is working to keep people out of the kingdom? While God is working to draw you closer to him, Satan is working to pull you away from him. Satan is always at work. Those weeds didn't just appear. Satan planted them. 1 Peter we read, be self-controlled and alert. Or be alert and of sober mind, that your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. The second lesson for me is that Satan's chief tactic is often to counterfeit that which is good. To counterfeit that which is good. 2 Corinthians, we read, Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. The third lesson I want to give you is that the weeds will not remain forever. Because there is something about punishment and judgment. And one day, at the great harvest, the weeds will be gathered up into a pile and burned, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, some may think that, well, I don't see that happening right now. I don't see that judgment going on right now. But don't make the fatal mistake of thinking that God's restraint means God's approval. Just because the judgment we may not see, don't think that God's restraint equals God's approval. Weeds can destroy a nation. They can destroy a community, can destroy a church, can destroy a family, can destroy an individual. If you ignore the weeds, you will pay a price. There is always a price to be paid. Our closing song